March 22, 1945. Near Oppenheim, Germany. 11:47 p.m. The Rhine moved like black oil beneath a moonless sky. Along its eastern bank, German sentries stamped their boots against the cold, their breath forming small clouds that dissolved into darkness. They had been told for months that the Americans would never cross here, not at Oppenheim, not without weeks of preparation, not without the thunderous overture that always preceded Allied offensives. The river was supposed to be a moat, medieval in its impregnability. And yet, in the stillness of that March night, something moved on the water. Small assault boats, their oars wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, slipped across the current like shadows. The men inside wore the Third Army patch, a white letter A inside a blue and red circle. They belonged to George S. Patton Jr., the general the Germans had been watching, fearing, and increasingly dismissing as an elaborate deception. For nearly a year, German intelligence had convinced itself of an extraordinary fiction, that Lieutenant General George S. Patton, the most aggressive and successful field commander in the European theater, was nothing more than a phantom. A carefully constructed fabrication designed to mask the true Allied strategy. Wehrmacht officers pored over intercepted communications, analyzed radio traffic, studied reconnaissance photographs of tank formations that seemed too perfect, too numerous, too conveniently positioned opposite the Pas de Calais. They built an entire defensive philosophy around a ghost army. They called it the First United States Army Group, FUSAG, and they placed Patton at its head, exactly as Allied deception planners had hoped they would. The ruse had worked brilliantly before D-Day, pinning German reserves far from Normandy. But now, in the spring of 1945, with the Rhine standing as Germany's last natural barrier, the deception had calcified into something more dangerous than belief, certainty born of wishful thinking. The German High Command needed Patton to be false because if he were real, if his Third Army truly existed in the strength it claimed, then the war was already lost. But those boats crossing the Rhine at Oppenheim were devastatingly real. The strategic significance of the Rhine River in March 1945 cannot be overstated. For the German military, it represented the final defensive line protecting the industrial heartland of the Ruhr and the approaches to Berlin itself. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had concentrated his remaining armor and infantry along its banks, transforming bridges into fortresses and towns into killing grounds. The Allies understood this. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group in the north, had spent weeks preparing for Operation Plunder, a massive set-piece crossing near Wesel that would involve 3 divisions, thousands of artillery pieces, and elaborate airborne operations. The entire German 15th Army waited for him there, dug into positions that had been reinforced since February. Montgomery's methodical approach was predictable, professional, and gave the enemy exactly what they expected: time to prepare, time to reinforce, time to make the crossing as costly as possible. Patton despised waiting. More accurately, he despised allowing the enemy to wait. His entire philosophy of warfare rested on speed, violence, and the psychological collapse that came from relentless pressure. While Montgomery stockpiled ammunition and drafted meticulous timetables, Patton studied his maps and saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. The Rhine bent and narrowed at several points south of Mainz. Oppenheim was one such place, a quiet river town where the Wehrmacht presence was thin, where expectations were low, whereas surprise crossing might slip through before the Germans could react. He had already cleared the Palatinate in a stunning 10-day offensive that chewed through 7 German divisions and captured over 60,000 prisoners. His divisions were exhausted, undersupplied, and dangerously extended. By every conventional measure, they needed to pause, to consolidate, to allow logistics to catch up. Patton saw only momentum. On the night of March 22, without fanfare or preliminary bombardment, elements of the 5th Infantry Division began crossing the Rhine at Oppenheim. They used storm boats and improvised ferries cobbled together by combat engineers who worked in near silence. By dawn, a full battalion was across. By midday, the bridgehead had expanded to 2 miles in depth. German commanders, when they finally grasped what was happening, responded with confusion and disbelief. Reports filtered up the chain of command describing American infantry and armor appearing on the eastern bank as if materialized from air. Some Wehrmacht officers assumed it was a feint, a diversionary raid that would be contained within hours. Others, more perceptive, felt the cold weight of recognition. Patton had done it again. He had moved faster than thought possible, had attacked where defense was weakest, had turned the Rhine from an obstacle into an embarrassment. And still, at the highest levels of German military intelligence, doubt lingered. How could Patton's Third Army be here, crossing at Oppenheim, when Fusag, the formation they believed he commanded, was supposedly staged in southeastern England, poised to strike across the Strait of Dover? The cognitive dissonance was profound. Documents captured later from German 7th Army headquarters revealed annotations in the margins of situation maps, question marks beside Third Army positions, skeptical notations about reported tank strengths, references back to intelligence assessments that classified Patton as a deception asset. The Germans had been so thoroughly convinced by the Fusag fiction that reality itself struggled to penetrate their certainty. The roots of this conviction stretched back to Operation Fortitude, the sprawling Allied deception plan preceding the Normandy invasion. Fortitude South, the component aimed at the Pas d'Es, needed a commander whose reputation would make the threat plausible. Patton, already famous for his leadership in North Africa and Sicily, was the obvious choice. German intelligence had tracked his movements obsessively. They knew his aggressiveness, his impatience, his preference for armored thrusts. Placing him at the head of an invasion force aimed at the shortest route to Germany fit every pattern they had observed. So they watched Fusag, they counted its phantom divisions, they held the 15th Army at Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for the real invasion that never came. But Fortitude was supposed to end with Normandy. By the autumn of 1944, Patton was clearly in France, his Third Army carving through Lorraine, racing across the Saar. And yet, the seed of doubt planted during Fortitude continued to germinate in German minds. Allied deception units, recognizing the opportunity, fed the paranoia. False radio networks mimicked Third Army communications while the real headquarters maintained strict signal discipline. Reconnaissance flights were allowed to photograph decoy tank parks. Double agents fed carefully crafted reports suggesting Patton's operations were smaller than they appeared, that the bulk of his forces remained uncommitted. The Germans, desperate for any information suggesting the Allies were weaker than they seemed, embraced these fragments of fiction. By early 1945, some Wehrmacht intelligence officers were circulating assessments suggesting Patton himself might be a fabrication, an actor playing a role, a composite identity invented to intimidate and distract. This was the landscape of disbelief that Patton shattered when his tanks began crossing the Rhine in force. On March 23, as engineers completed a pontoon bridge at Oppenheim, Patton himself walked across to the eastern bank. He paused midway, unzipped his trousers, and urinated into the Rhine, fulfilling a promise he had made weeks earlier to piss in the Rhine before Montgomery. It was a gesture of pure Patton, theatrical, crude, and strategically meaningless, yet psychologically perfect. He understood that warfare was as much performance as violence, that the enemy's perception of your capabilities mattered as much as the capabilities themselves. By the time Montgomery launched his meticulously planned crossing on March 24, supported by the largest airborne operation since D-Day, Patton had already been across for more than 24 hours and had seized a bridgehead 6 miles deep. He sent Montgomery a terse message. Crossed the Rhine last night. No losses. No fuss. No fanfare. The German response oscillated between panic and denial. Wehrmacht units along the river began reporting American armor appearing in sectors previously considered secure. The 6th Armored Division, spearheading Patton's exploitation, moved so rapidly that rear-echelon German formations found themselves overrun before they understood the front had collapsed. Logistical columns scattered. Command posts evacuated. Entire regiments surrendered to reconnaissance patrols. And through it all, in the cellars and bunkers where German staff officers updated their maps, the question persisted, was this really Patton? Could the Third Army genuinely possess this strength, this speed, This ubiquity? The soldiers experiencing the onslaught had no such doubts. A Wehrmacht lieutenant captured near Hanau in late March told his interrogators that his company had been ordered to hold a bridge approach for 72 hours, until reinforcements arrived from the Bavarian Reserve. Those reinforcements never came because the roads they were supposed to use had already been cut by American tanks. The lieutenant described watching American armored columns bypass his position entirely, uninterested in fighting for a bridge when they could simply build their own crossing. 3 kilometers downstream. "We expected battle," he said, recorded in a Third Army intelligence summary. "But they did not fight us. They just went past. Like we were already dead." This was Patton's operational art distilled: avoid strength, exploit weakness, maintain momentum above all else. The Germans had prepared to fight the methodical Montgomery. They were being destroyed by the impatient Patton. The symbolic weight of the Rhine crossing extended beyond tactics. For German civilians, the Rhine had been more than a geographic feature. It was a psychological threshold, the last barrier protecting the homeland from invasion. Nazi propaganda had spent years reinforcing this mythology, depicting the river as an insurmountable obstacle, a liquid wall that would break the Allied advance. Goebbels' broadcasts assured the German people that even if the Western Front collapsed, the Rhine would hold. American engineering capability, so evident in the rapid construction of bridges, demolished this comforting fiction in 72 hours. Engineers from the Third Army built 6 bridges across the Rhine within the first week, some capable of supporting 50-ton tanks, constructed under sporadic artillery fire by men working shifts that blurred into exhaustion. A German engineer officer, captured while attempting to demolish one of these bridges, expressed something close to admiration. "We blew our own bridges to stop you. You build new ones faster than we destroyed ours. What kind of army brings entire bridges with them?" This question struck at the heart of German miscalculation. They had underestimated not just American military strength, but American industrial capacity translated into field operations. Patton's divisions moved with logistical tales that would have seemed fantastical to Wehrmacht planners accustomed to chronic fuel shortages and improvised supply lines. Each American armored division consumed approximately 300,000 gallons of gasoline per day of active operations. The Third Army, comprising multiple corps with attached armor, required a constant flow of fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts that dwarfed anything the German military could sustain by 1945. This was the material expression of American abundance, as much a weapon as the Shermans and Thunderbolts. And yet, this abundance had almost become invisible to the Germans because they had convinced themselves it was theater, that the vast American supply depots, the endless convoys, the proliferation of equipment, were all props in an elaborate deception. Some Wehrmacht intelligence assessments from early 1945 include calculations attempting to prove that American supply consumption levels were impossibly high, and therefore must be exaggerated for psychological effect. These analyses concluded that Patton's Third Army could not possibly be as large or as well supplied as it appeared because such logistical throughput would exceed even American industrial capacity. It was mathematical reasoning used to deny observable reality, a kind of strategic wish-casting that comforted German commanders even as their front disintegrated. The first German unit to truly grasp the scale of what they faced was the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord, which encountered elements of the 4th Armored Division near Frankfurt on March 26. The SS Division, pulling back from the Saar, expected to establish a defensive line along a series of villages east of the city. Instead, they discovered American armor already occupying those villages, American infantry already entrenched in positions the Germans had planned to defend. A captured SS officer, interviewed at a Third Army interrogation center, described his shock. "We were told Patton's army was a fiction, that the real American strength was in the north with Hodges. But here they were, everywhere, more tanks than we had seen in the entire Ardennes. Either the intelligence officers were liars or they were fools. I think they were both." This sentiment, betrayal mixed with recognition, rippled through German ranks as the Third Army exploitation continued. Patton drove his divisions forward with an intensity that alarmed even his own staff. He slept 4 hours a night, held briefings at dawn, and personally visited forward headquarters to demand faster movement. His diary entries from this period reveal a man intoxicated by success but also acutely aware of time slipping away. He feared that Berlin would fall to the Soviets before American forces could intervene, feared that political considerations would halt his advance, feared that the war would end before he could deliver the knockout blow he believed was within reach. This urgency transmitted itself through the chain of command. Division commanders pushed their regimental colonels, who pushed their battalion commanders, who pushed their company officers, creating a cascading pressure that propelled the Third Army forward at a pace that exhausted logistics, strained maintenance, and shattered German cohesion. By the end of March, Patton's forces had advanced nearly 100 miles beyond the Rhine, liberating towns that had expected to be battlefields and instead became waypoints in a pursuit. The German Seventh Army, which had contested every mile in the Saar, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Prisoners streamed westward in columns that stretched for miles. Many surrendered willingly, relieved to escape an apocalypse they no longer believed could be averted. American units reported Germans emerging from cellars and bunkers without prompting, laying down weapons, asking simply to be fed. The Wehrmacht, at least in the West, was not fighting for victory, it was disintegrating under the weight of impossibility. And still, in Berlin, in the subterranean bunker where Hitler raged against reality, the fantasy of Patton as deception persisted. Intelligence summaries presented to the Führer in early April continued to suggest uncertainty about American strength, continued to reference phantom divisions and deceptive deployments. Hitler himself seized on these ambiguities, using them to justify increasingly delusional orders for counteroffensives and final stands. He wanted to believe that the Americans were weaker than they appeared, that their rapid advance was unsustainable, that German forces could still consolidate and strike back. Patton, in this diseased imagination, remained a psychological weapon rather than a physical threat, a bogeyman designed to demoralize rather than destroy. This cognitive failure had strategic consequences. German reserves that might have reinforced the Eastern Front against the Soviets remained in the West, guarding against American formations that German intelligence still assessed as partially fictitious. Panzer divisions were held back from critical sectors because commanders feared they might be needed to counter the real Patton offensive, the one that would come with the full weight of Fusag behind it. These divisions never engaged, never counterattacked, and eventually surrendered or were destroyed in piecemeal actions against Soviet forces who faced no such hesitation about American strength. The symbolism of the Rhine crossing found its most potent expression not in grand battles but in small, repeated encounters that accumulated into revelation. An American tank crew, having crossed at Oppenheim and pushed east toward Darmstadt, stopped in a village to refuel. German civilians emerged cautiously, expecting brutality or requisition. Instead, they watched as the tank crew brewed coffee using water from the village well and offered cups to the children who had gathered at a distance. One of the tankers, a farm boy from Iowa whose name appears in a letter archived at the Patton Museum, wrote to his mother, "They looked at us like we were from another planet. Not because we were enemies. Because we had coffee. Real coffee. They haven't seen coffee in a year. This small abundance, coffee, chocolate bars distributed to children, cigarettes offered to old men, communicated more about American capacity than any number of tanks. It said, we have so much that we can afford generosity. We are not desperate. We are not struggling. We are not you." For German soldiers raised on narratives of Aryan supremacy and German industrial might, these encounters were ideologically corrosive. The Third Reich had promised its people that Germany represented the pinnacle of modern civilization, that German engineering and discipline surpassed anything the decadent democracies could produce. Yet here were Americans, casual and undisciplined by German standards, operating equipment that functioned reliably, eating rations that seemed luxurious, moving with a logistical sophistication that made German supply operations look medieval. A Luftwaffe pilot, shot down by Third Army anti-aircraft fire in early April and brought to a POW processing center, later recounted his astonishment at the speed and efficiency of American field operations. They processed 200 prisoners in an afternoon. Fed us. Gave us medical checks. All while their columns were still moving past. In the Luftwaffe, such organization would have taken days. This was not Patton's doing specifically. It was the American logistical system functioning as designed, but it bore his imprint nonetheless. He demanded speed, and the machinery of war supplied it. The transformation in German perception occurred gradually, then all at once. By mid-April, Wehrmacht intelligence assessments no longer questioned whether Patton's forces were real. The debate had shifted to how to slow them down, how to create defensive lines that might hold for days rather than hours, how to evacuate troops before they were encircled. The fiction of Fusag collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence. The captured American soldiers who confirmed they served in Third Army units, the serial numbers on destroyed tanks that matched Third Army inventory, the intercepted communications that demonstrated operational continuity with forces that had fought across France and into Germany. Patton was not a phantom. He was the nightmare they should have prepared for but had convinced themselves they could ignore. On April 11th, elements of the Third Army reached the Elbe River, having advanced 400 miles in 3 weeks. They were within 50 miles of Berlin, closer than any other Western Allied force, tantalizingly close to capturing the German capital before Soviet forces could encircle it. Patton pressed Eisenhower for permission to continue, arguing that Berlin was militarily achievable and politically essential. But the decision had already been made at higher levels. Berlin was allocated to the Soviet sphere of operations, per agreements reached at Yalta. Eisenhower ordered the Third Army to halt its eastward advance and consolidate its positions. Patton complied bitterly, recording in his diary that the politicians had robbed us of our greatest victory. But the victory, in the sense that mattered to German soldiers and civilians who had endured the Third Army's advance, was already complete. Patton had transformed from a ghost story into a conquering reality, had shattered the Rhine barrier in days rather than months, had demonstrated that American military power was not deception but devastating fact. The psychological impact of this realization, that they had been wrong, that their intelligence had failed, that the enemy was stronger than imagined, contributed to the moral collapse of German resistance in the West. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Patton's Third Army had captured over 800,000 prisoners, destroyed or captured thousands of vehicles, and advanced farther and faster than any other Allied army in Europe. A German staff officer, captured in Bavaria during the final days of the war, told his interrogators something that captured the essence of what Patton's Rhine crossing had meant. "We were defeated many times, at Normandy, in the Bulge, at the Siegfried Line. But when your Third Army crossed the Rhine so quickly, without the preparation we expected, we knew it was not just defeat. It was irrelevance. You did not need to defeat us properly. You just needed to go past us. And you did. Like we were not even there." This was Patton's gift, not just the ability to win battles, but the capacity to make victory seem inevitable, to move with such confidence and speed that resistance appeared futile. He understood that modern warfare was partly physical and partly psychological, that breaking the enemy's will could achieve more than breaking their formations. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim, executed with minimal casualties and maximum audacity, delivered both messages simultaneously. We are stronger than you can resist, and we are faster than you can respond. In the decades since, military historians have analyzed Patton's Rhine crossing as a case study in operational art, the exploitation of enemy weakness, the maintenance of tempo, the integration of deception with action. But for the Germans who experienced it in March 1945, the crossing represented something more profound, the moment when fiction became reality, when the Phantom Army revealed itself as flesh and steel, when the comforting lie of American weakness dissolved into the terrifying truth of American strength. There is a photograph, taken on March 24, 1945, that captures this transformation visually. It shows a pontoon bridge across the Rhine at Oppenheim, one of the first Patton's engineers completed. Crossing the bridge is a seemingly endless column of Sherman tanks, their white stars bright against olive-drab paint, their tracks grinding forward with mechanical certainty. In the foreground, German civilians stand on the western bank, watching. Their faces are difficult to read in the grainy image, but their posture is unmistakable. Not defiance, not hope, but something closer to resignation. They are watching the future arrive, rolling across a river that was supposed to protect them, carried by an army they had been told did not exist. Patton himself appears in the background of this photograph, identifiable by his distinctive helmet and riding crop, standing beside a jeep and watching his tanks cross. He does not wave or gesture. He simply observes, allowing the machinery of war to express what words could not. This is real. We are here. And we are not stopping. The Germans were convinced Patton was bogus until American tanks crossed the Rhine in days. And when those tanks arrived, they carried with them not just firepower and momentum, but the collapse of every comfortable lie that had sustained German resistance. They proved that abundance could defeat ideology, that speed could overwhelm preparation, that reality, however unwelcome, would always triumph over fantasy. In the end, the Rhine was not a barrier. It was a revelation. And Patton, dismissed as a phantom, revealed himself as the most dangerous kind of enemy, the one you refused to believe in until he was already behind your lines, already victorious, already deciding what came next. The Germans learned this lesson too late, in the spring of 1945, when the river ran with the sound of American engines and the shore filled with prisoners who finally understood that Patton had never been a fiction at all. He was simply more real than they could afford to acknowledge, until reality arrived in the form of tanks crossing a river they had sworn could not be crossed, led by a man they had convinced themselves did not exist. The symbolic object that haunted this entire chapter, the one that followed German soldiers from belief to disillusionment, was not a weapon or a banner, but a map. Maps that showed Patton in England when he was in France. Maps that showed his divisions scattered when they were concentrated. Maps that showed the Rhine as a fortress when it was merely a river. Maps, in the end, that showed what German intelligence wanted to see rather than what existed. And when those maps finally updated to reflect reality, when the blue arrows representing Patton's advance stretched deep into Germany, they told the story of an army that had believed its own deceptions more than the enemy ever did. This is what makes Patton's Rhine crossing more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological checkmate, a moment when seeing ceased to be believing and became, instead, reckoning. The Germans had built their defense on certainty. Certainty that Patton was elsewhere, certainty that the Rhine would hold, certainty that American strength was partially illusory. Patton dismantled these certainties in 72 hours, replacing them with the cold weight of fact, bridges standing where they should not stand, tanks moving where they should not be, an army that refused to cooperate with the fiction constructed around it. And in that refusal, in the stubborn, aggressive, undeniable reality of American tanks crossing the Rhine in days, lay a truth about freedom and abundance that transcended the specific moment. Democracies, slow to anger and slower to mobilize, possess a patient fury that totalitarian regimes mistake for weakness. They produce not just soldiers but systems, not just courage but capacity, not just victories but inevitabilities. The Third Reich built its empire on mythology and will. The United States answered with factories and bridges, with coffee for children and gas for tanks, with an industrial democracy that could afford to be generous even in conquest because its strength was not scarcity managed but abundance deployed. Patton understood this instinctively. His aggressiveness was not recklessness but recognition. When you possess overwhelming material advantage, the only true mistake is hesitation. So he did not hesitate. He crossed the Rhine while others planned, attacked where defense was thin, and transformed a river from obstacle to memory in the time it takes to erect a bridge. The Germans were convinced he was bogus until his tanks crossed. And by the time conviction yielded to comprehension, the war was already decided, not by the crossing itself, but by what the crossing represented. It represented the arrival of reality, patient and relentless and crushing in its abundance. It represented the end of comfortable lies. And it represented, most of all, the simple devastating truth that Patton had embodied from Sicily to the Elbe, that in modern war, between tyranny and democracy, between scarcity and abundance, between belief and fact, reality does not negotiate. It simply arrives. And when it does, no river is wide enough to stop it.